Pulgasari is a kaiju movie set in feudal Korea based on the Korean mythological creature whose name means unkillable. It tells the tale of a living statue that feeds on iron, brought to life to combat the feudal lords terrorizing rural village. It's also a North Korean production, directed by South Korean filmmaker Shin Sang-ok, a job which he claimed to have been kidnapped to fulfill. Between the years of 1978 and 1986, Shin lived in and directed 7 films for North Korea, with Pulgasari being his last. I say claimed because while the kidnapping story is often related as fact in the United States, the sole evidence of Shin's version of events is his testimony and an as of yet unreleased audio tape of a conversation he had with second chairman of North Korea, Kim Jong-il. And when it comes to North Korea, it's kind of a wild west for information. Because they are infamously private and directly antagonistic to the USA, our access to information on the nation is rather sparse and indirect. But before we get into all that, first a plot summary. As feudal lords threaten a village, commandeering the people's homes and utilities to forge weapons, a blacksmith uses his dying breath to enchant a mold of the creature Pulgasari into being. It comes into the possession of his daughter, Ami, and is brought to life with a drop of her blood. Pulgasari then begins to feed on iron, growing larger with every piece consumed. It quickly occurs to Ami that it will be of great aid to the peasants' rebellion. Pulgasari becomes their champion, their savior, leading the rebels to victory and crushing the king under its foot. Watching it like any other campy 80s kaiju film, it's not too spectacular. The costume looks pretty cool, baby Pulgasari is kinda cute, and the big guy looks threatening, but I still kinda want to pat him on the head. This is probably not the best method of playback for the film, as it's a scan of a shitty old videotape, but aesthetically it is a little plain, akin to a Shaw Brothers Kung Fu flick or Heisei-era wrestler Godzilla movies. The sets can feel kind of empty, and even the scenes where Pulgasari is smashing buildings leave a bit to be desired. The script is rather bare with hammed up expositional dialogue, and I don't even remember any characters' names. But, he goes smash, and when Pulgasari steps on the king, that motherfucker goes splat on the pavement, and that's neat. It's pretty straightforward up until the end, where Pulgasari's hunger for iron persists, and the people find themselves right back where they started. Now indebted to Pulgasari for his protection, but also giving up their farming tools to feed his bottomless hunger. Ami expresses a fear that people will use Pulgasari to wage further wars, going from rebels to imperialists themselves, enacting an endless cycle of conquest to satiate their savior's appetite. So, Ami elects to sacrifice herself, the only way to stop Pulgasari, as its life is tied to hers through blood. She hides herself in a large bell made of iron and allows Pulgasari to consume her, paying with her life for the use of a super weapon to liberate the peasants. The movie's okay, but it's pretty impressive for a developing film industry, and it has a clear purpose for its monsters metaphor. This is undoubtedly a propaganda film. It lists Kim Jong-il as a producer and tells a story that is in line with the current government's portrayal of history. But what are the contents of this story? A peasant revolt against the oppressive aristocracy? Sign me up. Thoughts on ending the cycle of imperialism? Poignant? No sequel train that deludes the meaning of the original? The oppressive rule of the feudal lords recalls Japanese occupation of Korea. During their rule, the colonial government expropriated vast amounts of farmland and resold them cheaply to Japanese citizens. They also used Korea's resources to further their ventures as a capitalist nation, using Korea to make up the agricultural production that Japan sacrificed to bolster industrialization. During World War II, Koreans were drafted to replenish Japan's military and labor forces. The Japanese invaded, stole farmland from peasants, committed atrocities upon people, and used Korean resources and labor for military production, just like the feudal lords in the movie. Pulgasari then might be emblematic of the foreign powers that ended this colonial establishment. Directly following Japanese occupation came US occupation, and the split of Korea became a proxy war for the USSR and the US, though Korea was close to unifying prior to US intervention. But whether this be the United States or the Soviet Union, Pulgasari is a warning against depending on a monster to destroy a monster. A popular theory among Western viewers of this film surmises that this theme may also have been coded to critique North Korea itself. But I think that's more due to the fact that Pulgasari provides a universal cautionary tale of totalitarianism. It's also a theory fueled by the narrative Americans craft that all North Koreans are dumb and brainwashed enough that no human being was going to catch on that this film had something more to say, as well as a series of assumptions we make about North Korea's representation of itself that is based on media commentary with like 3 degrees of separation. Dare I say, our image of Korea is filtered through sensationalized coverage and military invasion propaganda, such that we are conditioned not to look at North Korean people, but rather at North Korea as an evil hive mind entity. This video started as a personal curiosity in a little-known kaiju movie that few people have written on, but that I felt was covered too flatly and ahistorically. If all you wanted was a little movie review that doesn't ask too many deeper questions, stop here. Because the more I gathered some basic evidence to frame North Korea's foreign relations and the dubious history of its defector narratives, the more I felt like I needed to clarify. Skepticism is supposed to be like a pretty American thing. Unfortunately, when it comes to many of the USA's foreign interests, people are not actually that discerning.
We tortured some folks.
So I'm going to be very explicit right now. There is a pattern of misinformation issued by our country about countries it is in conflict with. So I'm going to start poking holes in the story given by Pulgasari's director, Shin Sang-ok. In 1978, South Korean actress and ex-wife of Shin Sang-ok, Choi Yoon-hee, never returned from a trip to Hong Kong. 6 months later, Shin followed suit after traveling in search of her. On April 12, 1984, the pair held a news conference in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, where they announced that they left South Korea voluntarily to escape government harassment. A month later, their first North Korean film debuted in Pyongyang. On March 13, 1986, the couple approached the US Embassy in Vienna, Austria, seeking entrance into the United States. About 1 week later, North Korea issued a public statement in response to the news, saying, "They went to the American embassy to hide themselves, not in order to seek the so-called exile, but to embezzle a large amount of money they have got temporarily as a fund for film production from the authority concerned of our republic. We do not care whether Shin Sang-ok and Choi Yoon-hee seek asylum in the United States or go to any other places, but we can never connive at their illegal seizure of our state money." May 5th, 1986, US publications generally ran with Shin and Choi's story, printing such articles as this NYT piece by Bernard Wertzman that I just read from. In summary, it relays that Shin claimed that Kim Jong-il was a film buff with a desire to develop North Korean cinema, leading him to kidnap the pair. Choi, kidnapped first, refused and was placed under house arrest. When Shin was held, he believed Choi dead and also refused, and was then imprisoned for 4 years. When eventually reunited, they agreed to the deal, all the while looking for a means of escape. While in Austria for research on a film, the pair made contact with the US Embassy, with $2.3 million for the production sitting in a bank account under Shin's name. Upon defection, the CIA took great interest in their possible perspective on Kim Jong-il and the North Korean government. Shin also claimed that the revocation of his film license in the South was due to false reports by the KCIA to Park Chun-hee that he was conspiring against the South Korean government. The couple lived the next 3 years in a house provided by the CIA. 1990, Shin's first movie since his return, Mayumi, Virgin Terrorist, releases in South Korea. The film is based on the accounts of Kim Yeon-wi, the surviving North Korean agent arrested for the bombing of South Korean Air Flight 858. This film is not well documented in contemporary review sites or aggregators, but scores are generally low. Kim Yeon-wi is interesting because she was supposedly broken into confession by the Splendor of Seoul and was eventually given a pardon by then President Roh Tae-woo, with the explanation that she was brainwashed by North Korea and was therefore not responsible for her actions. She then lived under government protection, spoke to the press about how she regretted her actions and was brainwashed, which she has popped out to reiterate since that time, and married one of her guards. President Roh would eventually be indicted on bribery charges. In 2018, families of the deceased from that plane bombing sued Kim for defamation for calling them North Korean collaborators because they were interested in reopening the case. Throughout most of the 90s, Shin lived in and produced films in the US under the pseudonym Simon Sheen, mostly a shitty VHS Kids franchise called Three Ninjas. In 1999, Shin and Choi moved back to South Korea, where he would live until his death in 2006. He tried for much of his late career to finally produce the Genghis Khan film he had been working on for the DPRK, but was unable to embark on such a large-scale production again. Because so much of Shin Sang-ok's legacy is now tied to this story, it's a lot less common to see things that dig into much of what he did before all of this, other than that he made well-received films. So, let's do that first. Shin Sang-ok was born in Cheongjin, North Hamgyong Province, in 1926. His father was a prominent doctor, meaning he was from a relatively well-off family. At the time, Cheongjin was under Japanese occupation and is today located in North Korea. In 1944, Shin studied at the Tokyo Fine Arts School in Ueno, Japan. He returned to Korea in April of 1945, luckily evading imperial military service due to illness. Later that year, he entered into the film industry as a poster illustrator, and shortly after as an assistant production designer. His directorial debut, Evil Night, would release in 1952, and would tell the story of a comfort woman. Women and girls drafted into slavery for the Japanese Imperial Army, many of whom would provide the same service for American soldiers years later. Shin and Choi married in 1954, and she starred in multiple of his films. Clearly, Shin's early work was marked by anti-Japanese political messaging, but he was no stranger to making more overt propaganda films in his heyday. In 1959, he directed a film for the re-election campaign of American-appointed dictator of South Korea, Ri Sing-man, called Ri Sing-man and the Independence Movement. And when the following military dictator Park Chung-hee seized power through, you know the line, a military coup, Shin also developed a working relationship with him. However, over the years, Shin's production company continued to release films that were increasingly risque under Park's media censorship standards, eventually resulting in a revocation of the company's license. Park would be assassinated by Korean Central Intelligence Agency director Kim Jae-gyu the year after Shin arrived in North Korea, so an increasingly tumultuous political landscape was likely apparent. Park's successor, Chun Doo-hwan, would seize power in a similar fashion in 1980, and was not much more chill. Suffice to say that if either southern government deemed Shin Sang-ok's actions as willing participation in aiding North Korea, he'd never work in the film industry again at the very least. So when Shin eventually fled the DPRK, he went to the United States. That said, and as previously mentioned, there's a voice recording of a conversation between Shin and Kim Jong-il that allegedly supports his story quite well, the transcript and audio of which are not publicly available. British filmmakers Ross Adam and Robert Cannon, directors of The Lovers and the Despot, which is like the largest collection of the Kim Jong-il audio, believe Choi Yun-hee cooperated, referencing that many South Koreans doubted the kidnapping story, believing that Shin had arranged the defection to escape financial problems in South Korea. There were also multiple reports of North Korea kidnapping individuals, primarily from the ROK in Japan, as part of an effort to learn more about foreign countries and possibly train agents. North Korea's reported response to the topic has generally been to state that the individuals remain of their own volition or to deny. In one quite famous story of a South Korean family, Choi Gye-wol was reunited with her son Kim Young-nam in 2006 on North Korean soil, where he was joined by what appeared to be his new family. Kim's eldest daughter, Kim Hae-kyung, is believed to have been conceived with alleged Japanese abductee Megumi Yokota. Kim Young-nam remained in the north, not really giving an explanation to the press. And while many articles reaching a broader audience focused on the tearful reunion itself, few featured the actual thoughts of Kim's family. In an interview with Daily NK, Kim's sister, Young-ja, expressed little interest in the political overtones of the situation, stating, "We are more focused on our reunion than repatriation, and Japan focuses on repatriation rather than reunion. which is the cause of some disparity. North Korea has confessed to having a kidnapping program in negotiations with Japan, but details on what led Kim Jong-nam to this current point in time, or even the nature of his work for the northern government, are not clear. And it is notable that where the family is more interested in being able to see each other, they're wary of how their story will be used by government officials and media outlets. To compare the case of alleged Japanese abductee and late wife of Kim Jong-nam, Ryota Megumi, Ryota's parents, Saki and Shigeru, have consistently sought to raise awareness about the abductions. Shigeru, now deceased, helped establish the Association of the Families of Victims Kidnapped by North Korea, an organization existing for this very purpose. In 2002, 5 Japanese abductees returned to their countries of origin, though the DPRK claimed that 8 others, including Ryota, either never entered the country or are no longer living. However, in 1994, the DPRK sent Megumi's supposed remains to her family, which failed a DNA test, prompting Ryota Sakie to continue believing her daughter is alive. Kim Jong-nam confirmed that he was previously married to Ryota and that she died years prior. Repatriated Japanese citizen Soga Hitomi, who gives lectures on the topic, claims to have met her while working as a language instructor in North Korea. Still, the actual details of her life or those of other abductees still living in the DPRK are unknown. Were the abductees preyed upon beforehand, trapped after entering DPRK territory, spies who were found out, willing participants, prisoners, a combination of all? It's entirely possible that some cases are even more or less insidious than those that have been reported on thus far, but the entire picture is still unclear. Dare I wonder, are some of those alleged abductees, obviously not all, willing citizens? There's also the consideration, often left out of the question of their return, of whether or not these individuals want to return. North Korean life may indeed present unique challenges and restrictions, but after having built families and decades of life, leaving is complicated. It seems noteworthy that somebody like Ryota Sakie, who met with Presidents George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and supports further sanctioning North Korea, has been given more media attention than families in South Korea who are not as quick to demand aggressive policy actions, as much as they do pine for a day that Koreans across the DMZ can meet again. Do governments that have long been in conflict with the DPRK actually care about their missing persons? Or do they just like the potential their stories have to rally people around military action? Before we engage in the American pastime of turning our nose up at Asian countries ready to believe they're so barbarous without a second thought, I'd like to urge you to be a little more discerning, if not outright skeptical, of what information we receive here about countries ours used to have colonies in. Perhaps even to consider the influence of our international relations. From 1931 to 1942, Imperial Japan invaded and established colonies in the surrounding area. During this period, their expanded territories reached China, Taiwan, the Soviet Union, Burma, Thailand, French Indochina, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, the US-occupied Philippines, and the entire Korean peninsula. Korea was a full settler colonial state, relegating its indigenous population to second-class citizenry and using its land and resources to bolster Japan's economic and industrial strength. Japan infamously dodges and downplays this part of their recent history. Because of this occupation, many Koreans would come to reside in Japan and be counted among the civilian casualties accrued in World War II. After Japan's surrender to the United States following the first atomic bomb dropped on the civilian population of Hiroshima, despite their knowledge that Japan was discussing surrender, and then the second bomb dropped on Nagasaki even though they knew Japan definitely wanted to surrender, the USA took control of Japan's territories and revised their constitution to determine methods to disempower them from amassing such military strength again. This is an authority the US still holds to some degree, and is why Japan relies on the US for military support and pimps out its land for military bases. The US kept some former colonies of Japan for themselves, but also restored sovereignty to many of them, seeking to shift their stake from one of direct control to a market-based method wherein US entities and corporations maintain trade deals with the nation that render the other country reliant on US investors, while also offering them the priority selection of materials. This new face of resource extraction that leaves foreign powers with the short end of the stick is often referred to as neo-colonialism. One such freed nation was Korea. However, the USA hadn't fought Japan alone, and in fact, many Koreans had served in militarized forces aimed at ousting the invaders who displaced and terrorized them. One of these groups was ideologically in favor of communism, which is a system of government that capitalists dislike. Most American sources declare that the first leader of the North Korean territory, Kim Il-sung, was installed by the Soviet Union, probably because that's what the US did in the South with Ri Syngman. Whether that's true or not comes down to which sources you believe, ours or those of theirs that you can actually get your hands on, both of which I think you would be valid to lack confidence in. Regardless, this is the starting point of our media narrative about the unjust dictatorship of North Korea. A story you're probably used to hearing as the failure of communism. A leader establishes autocratic control through military power and runs their country into poverty by the hand of their own greed, taking the wealth of its industries away from poor little capitalists so that they can sleep atop solid gold fighter jets. They're insane, aggressive, and always have a new way to hurt you and your family, even though somehow nothing ever happens. As this battle continued to be waged at an ideological level, it became desirable to feature stories depicting the ineffectiveness and insanity of North Korean governance, both in the United States and its baby girl, the ROK. This group, the Korean Communist Party, did pretty well and had support from mainland China, as the vast majority of Korean exiles moved there and operated in or in collaboration with Manchurian communists, whose home was also being invaded by Japan. There was also the Soviet Union, who had warred with Imperial Japan twice when they were just Russia, and had provided support to Maoist forces in China as well as Korean rebels. Having accepted socialism into their hearts, things were getting tense between the Soviet Union and the United States, which was a country made up of 5 corporations in a trench coat. See, during World War II, the USSR had some of the most decisive victories against Nazi Germany, so their budding strength inherently pitted them against the other global superpower. This meant that the ideological battle against socialism could be directed toward the Soviet Union, and that the fallout of the Second World War would become a chessboard for implanting themselves into as many vulnerable nations as possible.
Pause.
However, Korea is made up of people, and people don't uniformly agree on things. So while some Koreans saw US involvement as desirable, others kind of wanted to have their land back for real. This made full reunification of the peninsula complicated. They couldn't just go back to the way things were, and the implications of their decision exceeded their own reach. However, they were in fact on track to reunify until the US came in with an assload of bombs and chemical weapons. This led the force in the north to draw on support from Maoist China and the USSR, which was hard to turn down, although many Asian socialist governments were skittish about relying so heavily on the Soviet Union. The United States, despite bombing more civilian populations, was not able to win this one. Instead, the two parties reached an armistice, which remains in effect today. The war never ended. Since this stalemate, North Korea has grown ever more reclusive, and the US has never taken their eyes off the region. Remind you of anybody? The USA enjoys a similar involvement in the South as they did in Japan, constitutional co-authorship and an assload of military bases. They also have never let up on their sanctions of the North, which cut the entire population off from trading with any of their allies. Today, the DPRK's largest importer is the People's Republic of China, which is a global superpower rivaling the US in economic dominance, but not worth risking direct conflict. The DPRK has attempted to resume relations with the South and the US at multiple times in history, but has withdrawn or been shot down because of the United States' conditions, usually demanding certain levels of access or installation of American corporations or military. The US has also refused to comply with such conditions as removing nukes from the surrounding area. Still, North Korea is inhabited by people, and people don't 100% agree with each other. Within many of these people's lifetimes, they were separated from relatives in the South or abroad and began to fear the odds stacked against their country. So some leave North Korea, which is kind of hard to do because contact outside the nation is limited. And if you move to America or the ROK, you have to apply for political asylum. This process involves questions about your remaining connection to your country of origin. This is not uncommon for immigration, but there is a particular concern of spies, or even people still sympathetic to that government. The interview could possibly maybe be seen as tying your acceptance into the country to your disavowal of North Korea. And for somebody more directly involved with their government, cooperation. North Korean exiles are thus incentivized to emphasize and embellish their disgruntlement with North Korea in a legal sense. But there's also social and monetary incentive. By this, I mean that South Korea literally pays defectors for their stories, and the more exciting ones often garner media attention. Those stories could also generate public recognition, which the big boys call clout and the doo-doo heads call social capital. Social capital can be levied to gain access to new positions. You might say, sell a book about your experiences, which sensationalizes your former country and tells a thrilling tale of escape. Get on talk shows and podcasts. Build connections with some of the worst human beings on this earth. Obtain a job as correspondent for a conservative media outlet. I don't know, just for imagination's sake. There are also many reports, issued after the initial face value statements, that reveal a defector has fled North Korea because they are wanted for a crime such as murder. The South is also not accepting of people leaving for the North, and under the National Security Act, has imprisoned people for speaking positively of the North or promoting reunification. Did we already forget that moment in the hit TV series Squid Game where this sentiment is communicated without explicit wording because it would be illegal to speak positively about the DPRK? There does, however, remain a fact that North Korea is not a perfect country. The dynastic rule of the Kim family is off-putting. The nation struggles to provide for its people when half the global community can't come over to play anymore. It has not even achieved communism. Joking aside, bad things definitely happen there. But all of these things also happen in the United States. We live in oligarchy, where political legacy children often hold high offices, and there's no limit to the amount of money a representative can receive in donations. Corporations are legally recognized as persons. We have infamous black sites where people are held prisoner and tortured without trial. We have the largest military in the world, with bases all around the world. We fund and train death squads and terrorist cells because it is advantageous to our stakes in a given region. Slavery is still legal here if conducted with an incarcerated population. People critical of our country and its allies can be ostracized, blacklisted, and sometimes imprisoned. We even have state-funded news media. How do missiles launched at civilian areas help the residents if they get caught in the blast? How do sanctions help people who are starving and should want to have access to the outside world? How does the unified rule of a single empire offer more freedom than support for the people within the country working to change their environment? The United States has historically had a vested interest in antagonizing the DPRK in ways that most definitely include a steady stream of propaganda. And while Americans usually hold some degree of mistrust against their government, we often underestimate how good the country is at getting you to agree with its objectives. They do not need to convince you to be wholeheartedly on their side, only that they are the lesser evil in this particular moment. One cloak and dagger at a time. Does Pulgasari stand the test of time? I don't know. Seems way less harmful than like any 80s action movie from here. And quite frankly, if most people watched it without knowing it was from North Korea, I think they'd find it makes a salient point.